They called the cops on me for trying to enter my own house. I'm standing outside my lakeside cabin with my keys in hand, and there's a complete stranger live streaming from my living room while the HOA president tells police I'm a dangerous stalker. Her friend was already living inside my cabin, had been there for weeks, and somehow I'm the criminal for coming home early from my business trip. What I discovered next about my HOA president and her friend will make you question everything you thought you knew about the people running your neighborhood. Comment below where you're watching from. This story will blow your mind. Let me take you back to where this nightmare really began. 8 months before all hell broke loose, I had filed what I thought was a simple complaint about my HOA President Diane Hawthorne's neon pink house. The thing was an eyesore that violated every architectural guideline we had, and as a software developer who appreciates clean, logical systems, it drove me absolutely crazy. I figured it was a straightforward issue. Point out the violation, she repaints it, problem solved. Boy, was I wrong about that. Diane was forced to spend $15,000 on a complete repaint job, and the whole thing played out at a packed community meeting where she was publicly humiliated in front of 50 neighbors. I remember sitting there thinking I was doing the right thing, protecting our property values and community standards. What I didn't know was that Diane was facing bankruptcy behind the scenes, desperately scrambling for money, and that my complaint had just painted a giant target on my back. The real genius of Diane's revenge plan was how long she waited and how perfectly she executed it. For months after that meeting, she was sweet as pie to me, waving when I drove by, asking about my work trips to Seattle, even commenting positively on my landscaping. I thought we'd moved past our disagreement like mature adults. Meanwhile, she was gathering intelligence about my travel schedule, studying my routines, and identifying the perfect moment to strike. She knew I traveled to Seattle regularly for client meetings, usually for a week at a time. And she knew my cabin sat alone at the end of our quiet street, where neighbors wouldn't notice unusual activity. But here's the part that still gives me chills. She had been coaching Stephanie Wilson for months before I even knew the woman existed. Stephanie was recently divorced, drowning in debt, and desperate enough to believe that this elaborate scheme was actually about helping women in crisis. The setup they created was masterful in its complexity and terrifying in its implications. Diane had convinced Stephanie that she was establishing a safe house network for domestic violence victims, and that my cabin was perfect because I was hardly ever there anyway. They created an entire fictional backstory. Stephanie was supposedly fleeing an abusive ex-husband she needed somewhere safe to hide while getting back on her feet, and Diane was the community hero helping her start over. The fake paper trail they built was incredibly detailed, staged photographs of Stephanie with makeup bruises that looked completely authentic, falsified police reports from her previous incidents, fake therapy session records documenting her trauma recovery, and even fake medical records showing injuries from domestic violence. They had thought of everything except for one tiny detail that would eventually bring down their entire operation. When my Seattle client meeting got canceled due to a family emergency on their end, I found myself driving home 5 days earlier than planned, expecting to relax in my peaceful cabin and maybe catch up on some personal projects. Instead, I pulled into my driveway and felt like I was living in some kind of alternate reality. My cabin, my sanctuary that I had worked so hard to afford, had been completely transformed. There were new curtains in the windows, different furniture visible through the glass potted plants that I had never seen before, and a car I didn't recognize sitting in my driveway like it belonged there. But the real shock came when I looked through my living room window and saw Stephanie Wilson live streaming on social media, giving what appeared to be a house tour of my property. She was talking about my cozy reading nook and the little kitchen where I make my morning coffee, describing my cabin like she was the owner showing off her home to friends. The woman had established a complete life in my absence. When I checked my mailbox, there were utility bills addressed to Stephanie Wilson at my address. When I walked to the front door, I could see through the window that she had personal photographs displayed on my mantelpiece, her clothes hanging in my closet, and her food filling my refrigerator. This wasn't someone crashing temporarily or hiding out for a few days. This was someone who had moved in and made herself completely at home. I stood there for a moment trying to process what I was seeing when Stephanie noticed me through the window. The transformation that came over her face was like watching an actor switch into character. One second she was relaxed and confident giving her house tour, and the next second she was screaming in absolute terror, grabbing her phone and calling someone while pointing at me like I was a dangerous predator who had come to hurt her. Within minutes, Diane came racing down the street in what I can only describe as the most ridiculous costume I've ever seen. A homemade vest with crisis response printed across the front in bold letters, complete with official-looking badges and a clipboard that made her look like she was running some kind of emergency operation. She immediately positioned herself between me and the cabin, pulling out her phone and calling 911 while speaking in the most dramatic, urgent voice imaginable. "I need police at 247 Lakeview Drive immediately. We have a domestic violence situation. A stalker has found his victim and is threatening her at her residence." I tried to interrupt, tried to explain that this was my cabin and that I had no idea who this woman was, but Diane just kept talking louder, drowning out my protests, while Stephanie sobbed convincingly in the background. When Officer Williams arrived, I felt confident that this misunderstanding would be cleared up quickly. I had my driver's license, my property deed, my mortgage documents, everything needed to prove that I owned this cabin and had every right to be there. But Diane was ready for this moment. She had prepared an entire presentation for the police, complete with documentation that painted me as an unstable neighbor with a history of harassing women. She showed Officer Williams all of my previous HOA complaints, describing them as evidence of my pattern of targeting strong women in leadership positions. She pointed out that Stephanie had been living at this address for 3 weeks, had her mail delivered there, had established accounts with local utilities, and was even recognized by name at the neighborhood pharmacy. To Officer Williams, it looked like I was some kind of unhinged property owner trying to evict an established resident who was clearly terrified of me. The final nail in my coffin was Diane's masterstroke of manipulation. She had coached Stephanie to mention specific local details that made her story seem authentic. Her favorite coffee spot downtown, the hiking trail where she goes to clear her head, the friendly clerk at the grocery store who always asks about her day. These weren't just random details. They were carefully chosen references that made it seem like Stephanie had been part of our community for much longer than 3 weeks. But here's where Diane made her one crucial mistake. Stephanie mentioned loving the amazing breakfast burritos at that cute coffee shop on Main Street. The problem was that the coffee shop had only opened 2 weeks ago after Stephanie supposedly arrived in town fleeing her abuser. I caught that detail immediately, but at the time I was too shocked and overwhelmed to point it out effectively. Despite having proof of ownership, despite having a clean criminal record, and despite having witnesses who could vouch for my character, I found myself being escorted away from my own property by a police officer who was convinced I was a dangerous stalker. Officer Williams explained that domestic violence law prioritizes victim safety above all else, which meant that even though I owned the cabin, I could be barred from the property if my presence posed a threat to someone claiming abuse. As I drove to the nearest motel, my mind was reeling with questions. How had this woman moved into my home? How had she established such a convincing presence there? And most importantly, what was I going to do to get my life back? But what I didn't know yet was that this coffee shop detail was just the tip of an iceberg that would destroy everything I thought I knew about my quiet neighborhood. I woke up in that sterile motel room the next morning to discover that my nightmare had exploded across the internet overnight. Stephanie had been busy creating content that painted her as the perfect victim, and me as the monster trying to destroy her life. Her video titled "Escaping My Stalker" had gained over 500,000 views in less than 12 hours, with thousands of comments from people who were genuinely concerned about her safety and absolutely furious with me. The comments section was a flood of support for her and hatred for me. "Stay strong, sister, we've got your back," and "This creep needs to be locked up," and "How is this predator still free?" It was like watching my entire reputation get incinerated in real time, one comment at a time. But here's the thing about being falsely accused of something so serious. It changes how you see everything. Every interaction, every detail, every piece of evidence becomes crucial because you know your life depends on proving the truth. That's when I started doing what I do best as a software developer. I began treating this like a complex debugging problem that needed systematic analysis. I created spreadsheets tracking Stephanie's social media posts against my documented travel dates, and the inconsistencies started jumping out immediately. She had posted photos settling into her new safe space on dates when I had verified receipts proving I was still in Seattle. She referenced local events and seasonal changes that she couldn't have witnessed if she had truly arrived when she claimed. Most importantly, she had made dozens of casual references to local businesses, restaurants, and community happenings that painted a picture of someone who had been living in our area for months, not someone who had fled there in crisis just 3 weeks earlier. I started screenshotting everything before she could delete or edit her posts, building a timeline that I hoped would eventually prove my innocence. While I was gathering evidence in my motel room, the community pile-on was getting worse by the hour. Someone had thrown eggs at my car in the motel parking lot, and there were neighborhood social media groups with names like Protecting Stephanie from Marcus that were dedicated to coordinating harassment against me. My coworkers had started treating me like I had some kind of contagious disease, avoiding me in meetings and whispering when they thought I couldn't hear. The most humiliating part was discovering that they had actually printed flyers with my photograph, Community Alert Dangerous Man, and posted them around the neighborhood like I was some kind of escaped convict. I felt like I was living in one of those dystopian movies where an innocent person gets branded as a criminal and everyone just accepts it without question. The legal consultation made everything feel even more hopeless. My attorney explained that domestic violence law is specifically designed to protect victims first and sort out the details later, which means that proving someone is lying about abuse is nearly impossible without overwhelming evidence. The legal fees would start at $15,000 and could easily double if the case dragged on, and the process could take 6 months or more just to get a hearing. Even worse, the court had already issued a restraining order that legally banned me from going within 500 feet of my own property. I was trapped in this legal quicksand where the more I struggled to prove my innocence, the more guilty I appeared to everyone watching. It felt like the system was designed to destroy people like me. People who follow the rules and expect justice to work the way it's supposed to. That's when Robert Wilson changed everything by approaching me in the grocery store. Robert was a retired police detective who had lived in our neighborhood for over 20 years, and he had this way of observing people that made you feel like he could see right through any lies or pretense. "Something about this whole situation doesn't sit right with me," he said quietly, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. "I've investigated real domestic violence cases for 30 years, and there are patterns you learn to recognize. This doesn't fit." The fact that Officer Williams respected Robert's judgment was huge because it meant that at least one person in law enforcement was starting to question the official narrative. Robert told me about his friend Kevin Morrison, who had lost his $200,000 cabin in an almost identical situation just 12 months earlier. A woman claiming to flee domestic violence had moved into Kevin's property while he was away, and by the time the legal process was finished, Kevin had lost everything and was living in a cramped apartment across town. Robert's investigation skills were exactly what I needed to make sense of this insanity. Within 48 hours, he had uncovered a pattern that made my blood run cold and my anger burn even hotter. Kevin Morrison's case wasn't an isolated incident. There had been 3 other similar cases in our area over the past 2 years, and every single one followed the same playbook. A woman would claim domestic violence, move into someone's property while they were traveling, establish residence there, and then force the legal owner to abandon their home rather than face massive legal bills fighting false accusations. But here's what made Robert's discovery truly terrifying. He found photographs of the same woman, Angela Thompson, involved in multiple cases across different properties with different fake backstories. She was like a professional victim for hire, moving from house to house, helping other women steal properties from unsuspecting owners while perfecting her acting skills. The evidence Robert gathered showed Angela coaching other women on how to perform convincing victim acts, teaching them makeup techniques for fake bruises, and rehearsing their stories until they could cry on command and tremble with fear at exactly the right moments. She had turned property theft into a business model, earning thousands of dollars for each successful placement while destroying innocent people's lives. The photographs Robert found showed Angela with different hairstyles and clothing, but the same calculating expression, posing in different stolen homes, like a real estate agent showing off her inventory. She wasn't just stealing one property. She was running an operation that had stolen millions of dollars in real estate from families who had worked their entire lives to afford their dream homes. As we gathered more evidence, Diane became increasingly desperate to shut down our investigation. She filed harassment charges against me, claiming that I was organizing some kind of conspiracy to intimidate and silence domestic violence victims. She even produced security camera footage that had been edited to make it look like I was stalking Stephanie when I was actually just documenting evidence from the public street. But the pressure was getting to Stephanie in ways that Diane hadn't anticipated. Robert noticed that she would hesitate before posting her attack videos against me, sometimes starting to write something, then deleting it, then rewriting it completely. You could see in her body language during her live streams that she was struggling with something, guilt, doubt, or maybe just the exhaustion that comes from maintaining an elaborate lie for weeks on end. The breaking point came when Stephanie made a crucial mistake during one of her coaching sessions with Diane. She accidentally went live on social media while Diane was prepping her for another performance, and the audio was crystal clear for everyone to hear. "Remember, act more scared when the neighbors are around," Diane was saying. "Make sure you mention how unsafe he makes you feel, and don't forget to emphasize that you're afraid he might escalate to violence." The viewers in the comments started questioning what they were hearing. "Wait, this sounds rehearsed," someone wrote. "Is someone coaching her on what to say?" wrote another. "This seems fake," added a third. Stephanie panicked when she realized what had happened and ended the live stream immediately, but it was too late. Several viewers had screen recorded the footage before she could delete it, and Robert showed me those saved clips that night. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt like we might actually have a chance to expose the truth. The question is, will this one deleted video be enough to expose a conspiracy that goes deeper than anyone imagined, or will Anne silence the witnesses before the truth comes out? Echo Stories viewers, what do you think I should do with this evidence? The next few days felt like watching someone slowly wake up from a nightmare, and that someone was Stephanie. Robert had positioned himself as the neutral neighbor who was just trying to understand what was happening, which gave him access to information that I could never get directly. He started noticing small things, how Stephanie would pause before answering certain questions, how she'd look uncomfortable when neighbors praised her for being so brave, and how she'd sometimes seem confused about details of her own story. The first real crack in her certainty came when she overheard Diane on a phone call talking about the Wilson operation is ahead of schedule. That word operation stuck in Stephanie's mind like a splinter. Why would helping a friend in crisis be called an operation? Why was there a schedule involved? These questions started eating away at the narrative Diane had so carefully constructed, and you could see the doubt beginning to show in Stephanie's social media posts. The confident, angry victim persona was slowly being replaced by someone who seemed uncertain and conflicted. Her live streams became less frequent, her posts became shorter, and when she did appear on camera, there was something different in her eyes, a kind of wariness that hadn't been there before. Robert told me that she had started asking him subtle questions about legal procedures, about how long domestic violence cases usually took to resolve, and about what happened to people who made false accusations. She never asked directly, but the implication was clear. She was starting to wonder if she was in deeper trouble than Diane had told her. Meanwhile, I was using my technical skills to analyze every piece of digital evidence I could find, comparing timestamps, checking metadata, and building a comprehensive timeline that showed exactly when and where each piece of Stephanie's story fell apart under scrutiny. Robert's investigation was revealing more disturbing details every single day. He had managed to track down Angela Thompson's complete history, and it read like a professional criminal's resume. Angela had been involved in at least 15 property theft schemes over the past 5 years, always playing the role of the experienced mentor who could teach newcomers how to perform domestic violence convincingly. She had literally turned fraud into a career earning $2,000 per month, plus free housing for her acting abilities. She had developed techniques for applying fake bruises that would photograph authentically, methods for making tears appear on command, and strategies for manipulating law enforcement officers' protective instincts. But the most chilling discovery was her training materials, actual written guides on how to establish credible victim presence and maintain consistent trauma responses under questioning. The real breakthrough came when Stephanie found Diane's coaching notebook hidden in a kitchen drawer. The thing was like a screenplay for destroying people's lives. There were detailed notes on perfect victim performance with specific instructions for different scenarios, how to react when confronted by the property owner, what to say to police officers to ensure maximum protective response, how to generate community sympathy through social media, and even backup plans for what to do if the victim's story started falling apart. When Stephanie realized that every emotion she had expressed, every tear she had cried, every moment of fear she had displayed had been choreographed by Diane according to a written script, something fundamental broke inside her. For the first time since this whole nightmare began, she cried real tears, tears of shame, horror, and genuine remorse for what she had done to an innocent person. But the worst discovery was yet to come. Stephanie found marketing materials, actual professional marketing materials, with her photograph and testimonials about how successful her placement had been. Diane wasn't just stealing my house. She was using Stephanie's image to advertise her criminal services to other potential victims and accomplices. There were brochures describing their emergency housing placement program and community protection services that made property theft sound like social activism. Stephanie's face was being used as the poster child for a criminal enterprise, and she hadn't even known it. When she saw those materials, she had what Robert described as a complete emotional breakdown. But this time, the tears were authentic. The fear was real, and the shame was overwhelming. While Stephanie was discovering the truth about her situation, Robert and I were uncovering the financial side of Diane's operation. Property records showed a clear pattern of distress sales that followed every domestic violence claim in our area over the past 5 years. Multiple shell companies were purchasing these properties at well below market value, then flipping them for enormous profits 6 to 12 months later. We found documented evidence of $2.3 million in suspicious transactions, all connected to properties where domestic violence claims had been filed against the owners. The most shocking discovery was the corruption network that made all of this possible. Documented payments to judges and police officers, people who were supposed to be protecting victims but were actually enabling organized property theft. Robert's law enforcement contacts helped us understand just how deep the corruption went. There were judges who had been taking 5-figure bribes to fast-track restraining orders without proper hearings, police officers who had been paid to ignore contradictory evidence or fail to investigate inconsistencies in victim stories, and city council members who had been approving suspicious property transfers without asking questions. This wasn't just a few people stealing houses. This was an organized criminal enterprise that had systematically corrupted our entire local justice system. The scope was so massive that Robert knew we needed federal involvement, but we had to be careful about who we trusted because we didn't know how far the corruption extended. When Robert finally approached Stephanie through a mutual neighbor offering her immunity in exchange for cooperation with law enforcement, she was terrified but also desperate to find a way out of the situation. She agreed to wear a wire and record her conversations with Diane, but you could see in her body language that she was scared for her life. She knew that if Diane discovered her betrayal, there would be serious consequences. The wire recordings that Stephanie gathered over the next week were more damning than any of us had imagined. Diane revealed that she was running active operations in 3 different states with 47 properties stolen over the past 5 years. She had training facilities where she taught women how to fake domestic violence symptoms, convincingly complete with makeup workshops for creating authentic-looking injuries and acting classes for maintaining consistent stories under police questioning. During one recorded conversation that still makes me sick to think about, Diane talked about her victims, people like me, with casual cruelty that revealed her true character. These rich men HOA'd properties while women suffer on the streets, she said. They deserve to lose everything for our survival. And if they're too stupid to protect themselves, that's their problem. But the final straw for Stephanie came when Diane started planning her next move against me. She wasn't satisfied with just stealing my cabin. She wanted to escalate the situation by framing me for actually committing domestic violence against Stephanie. The plan involved having Stephanie show up at a police station with fresh injuries, claiming that I had snapped and physically assaulted her in violation of the restraining order. That's when Stephanie made the bravest and most important decision of her life. While Diane thought she was out grocery shopping, Stephanie drove straight to the nearest FBI field office and walked through their doors with hours of wire recordings, detailed financial documents, and a complete confession about the entire criminal operation. She told the federal agents everything: the coaching, the fake documents, the property theft network, the corruption of local officials, absolutely everything. The FBI agent who interviewed her later told me that he couldn't believe what he was hearing because what had started as a simple property dispute had revealed one of the largest organized fraud conspiracies his office had ever encountered. Within hours, FBI phones were ringing across multiple field offices as agents realized they had discovered a multi-state racketeering operation that fell under federal jurisdiction. Stephanie had just provided them with evidence of crimes across state lines, systematic corruption of government officials, and detailed financial records showing millions of dollars in stolen assets. But here's what Stephanie didn't know yet. Diane has one final card to play that could destroy them both forever. Special Agent Rivera from the FBI's Organized Crime Unit took one look at Stephanie's evidence and immediately understood that we were dealing with something far more serious than a local property dispute. The interstate nature of Diane's operation meant this was definitely federal territory, and the Bureau wasted no time mobilizing resources. They had Stephanie's wire recordings providing probable cause financial records documenting multi-state fraud, and evidence of a corruption network that included sitting judges and active police officers. Within 48 hours, they had obtained federal warrants for coordinated raids across 3 different states. But Diane wasn't going to go quietly into that good night. She somehow sensed that federal agents were asking questions around the neighborhood, and she immediately went into full crisis mode, trying to destroy evidence, shut down active operations, and eliminate anyone who might testify against her. The desperation in Diane's actions became terrifying when she started making direct threats against Stephanie. "If I go down, you're coming with me," she told Stephanie during what everyone thought would be their final meeting. "You're just as guilty as I am, and I have enough evidence to prove you were a willing participant from the beginning." But Diane's most disturbing plan was something that would have destroyed both Stephanie and me permanently. She had arranged for a man in a ski mask to assault Stephanie in a public place and leave my wallet at the scene, creating ironclad evidence that I had finally snapped and attacked the woman I was supposedly stalking. The plan was to put Stephanie in the hospital with real documented injuries that would support every accusation she had made against me. It was calculated, vicious, and showed exactly how far this woman was willing to go to protect her criminal empire. Stephanie was absolutely horrified when she realized that Diane was literally willing to have her beaten and hospitalized just to create evidence against me. This wasn't about helping women or fighting injustice. This was about a sociopathic criminal who would sacrifice anyone, including her closest allies, to save herself. The realization that she had been working with someone capable of such cruelty finally broke through the last of Stephanie's loyalty to Diane. She immediately contacted her FBI handler and reported the assassination plan, giving federal agents the information they needed to intercept the hired attacker before he could reach her. They also managed to document Diane's connection to the would-be assailant, providing prosecutors with even more evidence of conspiracy and attempted assault. Meanwhile, Robert's network of retired police contacts had been conducting their own surveillance operation, watching Diane's movements and documenting her increasingly erratic behavior. They observed her making multiple trips to a storage facility where she was apparently keeping boxes of evidence related to her various criminal operations. They watched her meeting with people who were clearly not domestic violence victims, people who looked more like business associates discussing financial arrangements. Most importantly, they documented her attempts to contact corrupt officials who had been taking her bribes, apparently trying to call in favors to shut down the federal investigation. Every piece of surveillance evidence was being shared with Agent Rivera's team, building an ironclad case against not just Diane, but her entire criminal network. Angela Thompson's attempted escape provided federal agents with exactly the break they needed to expand their investigation beyond our local area. She had tried to flee the country with over $200,000 in cash stuffed into her luggage, but airport security flagged her at the checkpoint because traveling with that much money triggers automatic scrutiny under federal banking laws. When Transportation Security Administration agents questioned her about the cash, Angela tried to put on her victim performance one more time, complete with tears and claims that she was fleeing an abusive situation with her life savings. But there's something about professional security personnel that makes them harder to fool than local police or community members. The agents could tell that something was wrong with her story, and when they ran her identification through their computer system, it came back flagged by the FBI as a person of interest in an ongoing federal investigation. Within minutes, Angela went from trying to board an international flight to sitting in federal custody, and once she realized she was facing serious federal charges that could put her in prison for decades, she completely broke down and started confessing everything. She provided federal agents with a detailed list of every victim, every stolen property, and every accomplice she had worked with over the past 5 years. Her cooperation revealed the true scope of Diane's criminal enterprise. This wasn't just about stealing individual houses, but about systematically manipulating entire housing markets in small lakeside communities across 3 states. Angela's testimony also revealed the sophisticated training programs they had developed, complete with acting workshops, makeup tutorials for creating fake injuries, and psychological manipulation techniques for gaining community sympathy. The federal investigation expanded rapidly as agents realized they weren't just looking at property fraud, but at a racketeering conspiracy that had corrupted multiple local governments. They discovered detailed financial records showing $2.3 million in stolen properties, but more importantly, they found evidence of the bribery network that made it all possible. Judges who had been taking bribes to expedite restraining orders, police officers who had been paid to ignore contradictory evidence, city council members who had been approving suspicious property transfers, and even some federal employees who had been providing inside information about ongoing investigations. The corruption was so extensive that Agent Rivera had to bring in a specialized task force from the Justice Department's Public Integrity section to handle all the government officials who were involved. The logistics of coordinating simultaneous raids across 3 states were like something out of a crime thriller movie. Federal agents had to hit 47 different properties at exactly the same time to prevent Diane's network from destroying evidence or fleeing the country. They identified 23 people who were directly involved in the conspiracy, including corrupt judges and police officers who had been essential to the operation's success. The raids required coordination between multiple FBI field offices, state and local law enforcement agencies that hadn't been compromised, and federal prosecutors who could handle the complexity of multi-state racketeering charges. Every aspect of the operation had to be kept secret until the moment they executed the warrants, because they knew that Diane had informants throughout the local government who would tip her off if they suspected anything. But Diane's survival instincts were sharper than anyone had anticipated. She sensed that something big was coming and made one final desperate gambit to save herself. She started organizing community rallies to protect Stephanie from federal harassment, claiming that corrupt FBI agents were trying to frame innocent community leaders who were just trying to help vulnerable women. She even attempted to use her political connections with the corrupted officials she had been bribing, hoping they could somehow shut down the federal investigation before it destroyed her entire operation. Her final desperate move was both brilliant and completely insane. She barricaded herself inside my cabin, with Stephanie claiming that federal agents were trying to silence them both before they could expose government corruption. Diane went live on social media from my cabin, broadcasting to thousands of viewers, and started confessing everything on camera in a desperate attempt to gain public sympathy. She was streaming live to thousands of viewers, claiming that corrupt federal agents were trying to frame innocent community leaders who were just helping vulnerable women. But what she didn't realize was that every word she spoke was being recorded by the FBI and would become evidence in her federal trial. The standoff lasted for 6 hours, with federal agents surrounding my cabin, while Diane held Stephanie inside, still believing she could manipulate her way out of this situation. When Stephanie finally convinced her to surrender so they could expose the truth together, Diane walked out in handcuffs, still ranting about government conspiracies, while her live stream showed thousands of viewers watching her get arrested in real time. The trial should be straightforward with all this evidence, right, wrong. What happens next will shock even the FBI agents who thought they'd seen everything. Echo stories. Viewers, do you think Diane will go down quietly or fight back? The federal courthouse looked like a media circus had taken over downtown. Court TV had set up their broadcast equipment. Netflix documentary crews were filming everything for their true crime series, and there were so many reporters that they had to establish overflow viewing areas for people who couldn't get seats in the main courtroom. The case had captured national attention because it represented every homeowner's worst nightmare. Corrupt officials using fake domestic violence claims to steal people's most valuable possessions. But the media attention also brought some genuinely disturbing elements. Stephanie was receiving death threats from radical groups who claimed she was betraying the sisterhood by exposing what they called creative housing justice. Federal marshals had to provide 24-hour security for her and her family because some organizations were treating Diane like a folk hero who had been fighting patriarchal property systems. The prosecution's opening statement laid out a case so overwhelming that I wondered how anyone could possibly defend against it. They had over 500 pieces of physical evidence, detailed testimony from 47 victims across 3 states, and financial records that documented exactly $2.3 million in systematic theft over a 5-year period. But the most devastating evidence was Diane's own voice. Hundreds of hours of recorded conversations where she described in detail how she had manipulated the legal system, corrupted government officials, and destroyed innocent families for profit. When the prosecutor played those recordings in court, you could hear Diane's voice echoing through the silent courtroom. These rich men deserve to lose everything. If they're too weak to protect their property, that's natural selection in action. When Stephanie finally took the witness stand, the entire courtroom fell completely silent. You could have heard a pin drop as she described the months of coaching that had transformed her from a desperate woman into a professional victim performer. She testified about the makeup techniques Diane had taught her for creating authentic-looking bruises, the acting classes where she learned to cry on command and tremble with fear at precisely the right moments, and the detailed scripts she had been given for different scenarios she might encounter with police officers, neighbors, or legal officials. "I lost myself completely," she said, breaking down in genuine tears that were nothing like the fake ones she had performed for months. "Every emotion I showed was scripted, every moment of fear was choreographed, and I destroyed innocent people's lives because I believed I was helping other women escape abuse." Diane's defense strategy was both predictable and absolutely infuriating to watch. She had fired her court-appointed attorneys and decided to represent herself, which gave her the opportunity to turn every court session into a theatrical performance about how she was the real victim of a massive government conspiracy. She insisted that she had been protecting homeless women from greedy property owners, and that her actions were completely justified because wealthy men were HOAing resources, while vulnerable women suffered on the streets. She tried to portray herself as a social justice warrior who had been persecuted by corrupt federal agents working on behalf of rich male property owners who wanted to silence her activism. Every word out of her mouth was calculated to generate sympathy and deflect responsibility for the massive criminal operation she had been running. But then the federal prosecutor dropped a bombshell that nobody in the courtroom saw coming, including me. The FBI's investigation had uncovered evidence of an additional 200 properties nationwide that had been stolen using identical methods to what Diane had used in our community. She wasn't the criminal mastermind behind this operation. She was just a small-time player in a massive organized crime network that stretched across the entire country. Federal agents had discovered a coordinated network of 15 other HOA queens who were running similar property theft schemes in lakeside communities from coast to coast, all of them using the exact same domestic violence fraud playbook that had been developed and refined over years of successful operations. The scope of this criminal conspiracy was absolutely staggering when the full details were revealed in court. These women had stolen over $50 million in property from more than 500 families nationwide, and they were all connected through sophisticated online training programs and money laundering networks that helped them convert stolen real estate into untraceable cash. Diane's operation in our quiet neighborhood was just one small tentacle of a massive criminal organization that had been systematically targeting middle-class property owners for years. The courtroom erupted in chaos when this information was presented because it meant that thousands of families across the country had been victimized by variations of the same scheme that had destroyed my life. Diane's reaction to this revelation was to have a complete psychological breakdown right there in open court. She started screaming that everyone was lying, that I had somehow orchestrated a nationwide federal conspiracy to frame her, and that the FBI had manufactured evidence to destroy her reputation as a community leader. She accused Stephanie of being a federal agent who had been planted to entrap her, claimed that Angela had been tortured into providing false testimony, and insisted that all of the recorded confessions were somehow digitally fabricated using artificial intelligence technology. The judge had to order her removal from the courtroom multiple times for contempt of court, but Diane kept disrupting the proceedings by shouting accusations at witnesses and making threats against people who were testifying against her. It became clear to everyone watching that this woman had completely lost touch with reality and genuinely believed that she was the victim of an elaborate conspiracy rather than a criminal who had been caught red-handed with overwhelming evidence. Her paranoid rants and increasingly erratic behavior actually helped the prosecution's case because they demonstrated exactly the kind of manipulative personality that could orchestrate such an elaborate fraud scheme. The contrast between her courtroom meltdowns and the calm, factual testimony of her victims made it impossible for anyone to sympathize with her claims of persecution. Angela Thompson's testimony was absolutely devastating for any remaining shred of Diane's credibility. She provided complete detailed descriptions of every property theft operation, every fake victim training session, and every bribe payment they had made to corrupt government officials over the years. She showed the jury actual training materials from what she called their Domestic Violence Acting Academy, including written scripts for different scenarios, makeup tutorials for creating realistic-looking injuries, and psychological manipulation techniques for gaining sympathy from law enforcement officers and community members. Her plea agreement had reduced her potential sentence to 5 years in exchange for complete cooperation, but her testimony revealed the cold, calculated nature of their entire operation. When I finally got the opportunity to deliver my victim impact statement, I tried to explain what it feels like to be forced out of your own home and branded as a dangerous criminal by people who are supposed to be your neighbors and protectors. I described the psychological trauma of watching your entire reputation get destroyed on social media, the financial devastation of legal fees and lost income, and the deep sense of betrayal when you realize that people you trusted were actively working to destroy your life for profit. But more than anything, I wanted the court to understand that this wasn't just about property or money. It was about the fundamental trust that holds communities together and how these criminals had weaponized our desire to protect vulnerable people against innocent families who had done nothing wrong. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all 47 federal charges, including racketeering under the Organized Crime Control Act. Judge Harrison sentenced Diane to 35 years in federal prison with absolutely no possibility of parole, plus $2.8 million in restitution to victims and additional punitive damages that would ensure she could never profit from her crimes. All of her personal assets were seized for victim compensation, including her house, her vehicles, and every penny she had stolen over the years. When the sentence was read, Diane's final outburst was captured on live television and broadcast around the world. "You'll all regret destroying a community hero," she screamed, as federal marshals placed her in handcuffs. "I was protecting women while you defended greedy predators." The footage of her being led out of the courthouse in shackles became an instant internet sensation, with HOA Karen gets life sentence trending globally across every social media platform. With Diane behind bars, everyone thought the nightmare was over. But sometimes the most dangerous part comes after you think you've won. Bozol. Chapter 6. Ultimate Justice and Legacy. 250 words. 6 months after Diane's sentencing, I was finally starting to believe that my life could return to something resembling normal. My reputation had been completely restored. I was actually being called a national hero for exposing this massive fraud network that had destroyed so many families. The financial compensation was substantial, $500,000 in damages, plus complete coverage of all my legal expenses, and my cabin's property value had more than doubled because of all the media attention surrounding the case. Real estate agents were marketing our neighborhood as the famous case location and using it as an example of reformed HOA governance that actually protected homeowners instead of exploiting them. But the most meaningful change in my life was discovering a sense of purpose that I had never experienced before. I started speaking at conferences about HOA abuse and property fraud, helping other victims recognize the warning signs of these sophisticated scams, and working directly with federal legislators to draft stronger legal protections for property owners who find themselves targeted by corrupt community organizations. The speaking fees alone brought in over $200,000 annually, but the real reward was the letters I received from families who had avoided being victimized because they recognized the red flags after hearing my story. I was preventing other people from going through the nightmare that had nearly destroyed my life, and that gave me a sense of satisfaction that no amount of money could provide. Stephanie's journey toward redemption was equally remarkable and inspiring to witness. Even though her immunity agreement meant she faced no criminal charges, she insisted on completing 500 hours of community service, helping real domestic violence victims at local shelters and crisis centers. She went back to school and earned her license as a therapist, specializing in manipulation recovery, focusing on helping people who had been victimized by various types of psychological abuse and fraud schemes. She married a social worker she met during her community service work, and together they built a beautiful life dedicated to helping other people heal from trauma and rebuild their sense of trust in the world. Stephanie often speaks alongside me at conferences and community events, explaining how she was manipulated and providing insights into the psychological techniques that criminals use to turn desperate people into unwilling accomplices. Her story of transformation gives hope to other people who have made serious mistakes and want to find a way to make things right. She's living proof that people can change when they face real consequences for their actions and receive proper support for making amends. Her courage in testifying against Diane and exposing the entire criminal network probably saved hundreds of other families from being victimized. The transformation of our community was beyond anything I could have imagined when this nightmare first began. Property values increased by 25% after the fraud was exposed, and all the corrupt elements were removed. But the more important change was that we developed genuine relationships with our neighbors for the first time. The shared experience of being manipulated by Diane actually brought us together as a real community, instead of just a collection of individual property owners following arbitrary rules. We elected a completely new HOA board with transparent leadership and completely overhauled all our community guidelines to prevent future abuse of power. Real estate agents now actively promote our neighborhood as an example of the reformed HOA model, and we've become a destination for people who want to live in a community with ethical governance and genuine neighborly relationships. We even established an annual Truth Day celebration to commemorate the anniversary of Diane's arrest, and to remind ourselves to always question authority when something doesn't feel right. It's become a community tradition that attracts visitors from other neighborhoods who want to learn how to protect themselves from similar scams. Angela Thompson served 3 years of her 5-year federal sentence and was released early for good behavior and continued cooperation with ongoing investigations. She now works in retail, participates in regular therapy sessions, and has personally apologized to every victim's family that was willing to meet with her. Her transformation appears to be genuine. She understands the enormous harm she caused and works every day to make amends for her actions through legitimate community service. She's become an advocate against fraud participation, speaking to community groups about how easy it is to get drawn into criminal schemes when you're desperate and vulnerable. Her story serves as a warning to other people who might be tempted to participate in easy money schemes that seem too good to be true. The legal precedent established by Chen versus Hawthorne has been studied in law schools across the country and cited in over 200 similar cases nationwide. The HOA Accountability Act has been passed in 15 states, creating new transparency requirements and much stronger legal protections for property owners who are targeted by corrupt community associations. Federal domestic violence laws have been strengthened with better fraud prevention measures, making it significantly more difficult for criminals to abuse the legal system that's designed to protect genuine victims. The federal task force created specifically to investigate HOA corruption has led to hundreds of additional arrests and millions of dollars recovered for victims across the country. 2 years after the trial ended, I married the federal prosecutor who had worked on my case. Our professional relationship had gradually developed into mutual respect and eventually genuine love, and she understood better than anyone else what I had been through during those dark months. We're expecting our first child now, and my cabin has been transformed from a place of trauma into a family home filled with joy and hope for the future. I continue my advocacy work part-time while maintaining my software development career, and together we've helped over 500 HOA abuse victims annually through our nonprofit organization. I was even awarded a Presidential Medal for Community Service, which felt completely surreal, considering that just 2 years earlier, I was being branded as a dangerous predator by my own neighbors. But the real reward isn't the recognition or the money. It's the knowledge that we've changed federal law and created systemic protections that will prevent thousands of other families from experiencing what we went through. Diane's current situation is exactly what she deserves after destroying so many lives for profit. She's serving her sentence at a maximum security federal correctional institution with no special privileges or treatment whatsoever. Her prison job involves cleaning bathrooms for 23 cents per hour, and she's completely isolated because even other inmates avoid her after learning about the nature of her crimes. She receives no visitors, gets no letters, and spends her days maintaining the delusion that she was somehow the victim of a vast government conspiracy. Recent prison interviews show that she still claims complete innocence and continues to insist that I somehow orchestrated a federal frame-up to destroy her reputation as a community leader. Last week, I received a phone call that brought everything full circle. "Marcus, we have a situation in Texas," the voice said. It was another HOA abuse case with eerily similar patterns. Corrupt board members using different but related scam methods to steal properties from innocent families.